Hello, welcome to this, the sixth of my short videos introducing the ideas of Marx and Marxism. In this one, I'm going to be talking about Marx's theory of history, otherwise known as the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. This will be the first of two videos on this subject. Marx developed the core of this theory in a very short space of time, in about a year between 1844 and 1845, and when he was very young, 26 to 27. It's an extraordinary intellectual achievement, one of the great intellectual achievements in history. And what made this possible, I would argue, is his discovery, just immediately prior to this, of the revolutionary potential of the working class. From that point on, Marx viewed all questions of theory, or all questions of history from the standpoint of the working class, and this gave him a new vantage point from which to completely turn upside down the whole interpretation of history, the whole understanding of history that had hitherto prevailed. Before Marx, and to a considerable extent after Marx in, mainstream circles, history is seen primarily as the deeds of great men, kings, sometimes queens, generals, presidents, and the like. It is their actions, the actions of the Alexander the Great, Queen Elizabeth I, the Peter the Great, Napoleon's, even Hitler, who determine the main shape of history. In a slightly more sophisticated view, it's not great individuals, but great ideas that shape history, great abstract ideas. And so you get the idea that the driving force of history might be religion, or nationalism, or liberalism, or reason, or some other abstract concept like that. So you might have the idea that the 18th century is the age of reason. The 19th century might be seen as the age of nationalism, or the age of democracy, or something like that. Marx rejects both these interpretations of history as both different versions of a bourgeois view of history from the top down. Instead, basing himself on the working class, he views history from the bottom up, with a focus on the activities of the large mass of ordinary people. For Marx, the starting point of an analysis of history is how ordinary human beings relate to nature and how they produce the basic means of subsistence, the means of life for themselves. Engels summed this up in a quotation I shall read from his speech at the graveside of Marx in 1883. He said, "As Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc." And from this, Engels says that followed the conclusion that the production of the means of subsistence constitute, I quote again, "the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must therefore be explained instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case." This central idea of an economic base and a political ideological superstructure in society needs illustration with some examples. Let's take first the great Reformation of the 16th century. For centuries, most of Europe was dominated by one religion, one church, which we now would call Catholicism. In the 16th century, beginning with Martin Luther in 1517, this changed. Europe was plunged into 150 years of civil wars, conflicts, religious wars they were called, and so on, and continued thereafter to be divided into Protestant and Catholic countries. Why? Why did this great change occur? Was it perhaps that Martin Luther and half the population of Europe were divinely inspired to expose the corruption of the church and return to true religion, as I guess they imagined? Or was it that Martin Luther and half the peoples of Europe were suddenly led into error by Satan? Historical materialism obviously rejects either of these or both these explanations. Rather, it sees the Reformation as the ideological reflection of the fact that the feudal economic system that had prevailed hitherto was in decline, and that within it a new economic system, capitalism, was on the rise. The old religion, Catholicism, was a religion primarily of the feudal aristocracy, representing and articulating their view of the world and supporting their order. Protestantism was fundamentally the religion of the rising bourgeoisie. So this great conflict had not religious but material social roots. And the same, Marxists argue, applies to all such major historical events. I give two other examples that illustrate it. The US Civil War in the 19th century. Was it the case that people born north of the Mason-Dixon line were innately morally superior to those born south of the Mason-Dixon line, and therefore just naturally rejected slavery, whereas those in the south supported it? No. The root of the conflict was that in the north you had modern industrial production which required wage labour. South of the line in the Confederacy, you had an economic system based on plantations, tobacco, cotton, and so on, which needed and relied on slave labour. That was the root of the problem. Similarly, take the First World War. The First World War was not caused fundamentally by the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo in 1914, nor was it a family quarrel between king, kaiser, and tsar. At the root of the First World War and the subsequent deaths of 16 to 18 million people was a struggle between the great capitalist imperialist powers to carve up the world. That struggle was driven by their imperialist economic interests, and so on. And that applies generally. Now, Marx's focus on production led him further. It led him to distinguish two aspects of production. The first he called the forces of production. This refers to, most simply, the tools that a society had, but also the labour to work those tools and the knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, to deploy them. This constituted the ability of that society to produce goods. Second aspect of production, inextricably linked to it, was the question of relations of production. This was the social relations that human beings entered into in the process of production, relations between themselves. And for the last 6,000 years or so, those relations have been exploitative relations and class relations. Now, for Marx, there is a dialectical relationship between the forces and relations of production. First, the level of the forces of production shapes or conditions the relations of production. If as forces of production you have basically stone tools and bows and arrows only, then you will not get feudal lords or wage labour. What you will get is hunting and gathering in small clans. If you have modern engineering, steam, power, factories, and the like, what you will get is wage labour and modern capitalism, not at least for any length of time, the rule of feudal lords and certainly not primitive communism. At the beginning, the relations of production, that is the class social relations of society, usually act as a form of development of the forces of production. They facilitate their growth, but with time they turn into a fetter, Marx says, on the forces of production. They start holding them back. When that happens, you get a conflict in society. There is, of course, a ruling class with a vested interest in the maintenance of existing social relations. Those social relations make that class, the feudal aristocracy, the modern capitalists or whoever, into the ruling class in that society. So they defend that. Then the conflict between the forces of production that are developing and the relations of production that are a fetter on them turn, Marx says, into an epoch of social revolution in which the whole superstructure of the society, its politics, its institutions and so on, are, in his words, sprung into the air and remade. In this way, Marx's theory of history turns into a theory of social and political revolution. How all this works, I shall explain further in the second video on this subject. Thank you.